Hello there and welcome to this vlog of May 2022. And today's topic is going to be about my home brew changes in BattleTech Tabletop. Now, I've been trying to think of a way to run through this because my changes are kind of an eclectic mixture of some elements of Alpha Strike combined with some of the very good rule changes actually in things like the Tactical Operations Guide and certain other books that fix problems with classic BattleTech. So I've incorporated those two things along with my own weird, unique house rules. Now, before I get into this, it's quite important to say that I don't particularly like doing house rules or homebrew because it fields itself outside of the lingua franca that should be a gaming system. So, but that's not my fault, right? It's kind of the fault of the people who created BattleTech originally, that Classic is just too slow. Alpha Strike, to me, doesn't have much charm to it and is too quick and dirty. So I feel like there is a halfway, nirvana somewhere, that exists in BattleTech that I think we're all striving for. And I think at the same time, it's BattleTech's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Its greatest strength because if you've got a group of friends who play BattleTech, there's just so much data to choose from and be like, oh, that's a good idea, that's a good idea, that's a good idea. And they're really laissez-faire on the rule system. So, unless you're going to a proper tournament that's got a tournament organizer who's set in stone the rules. And, this happens for all tabletop games, but especially for BattleTech, it's kind of encouraged. And everyone will kind of have a fix for machine guns, which are terrible in classic BattleTech. Or, people will, try to do workarounds. And the community then, which is usually really strong, and BattleTech is very community-driven, will kind of all fire ideas at each other and all cherry-pick what we think is best personally. But why it's its greatest weakness is because you try operate that system and then run a successful competitive scene. Well, I'm afraid that's not possible. We've seen that a lot with BattleTech. There are tournaments in BattleTech. Tournaments get run fairly regular, especially in the US, and I'd imagine in Germany and Australia. Not so much in the UK, but we have had them before. And I think that's a shame, really, because if there was a version of BattleTech that we could just all agree upon and play it, then I think the tournament scene would really hit off, because it's really fun to play 6mm warfare with big, giant war machines and, combined arms like tanks and infantry and things like that. But it's that, if you do that, though, you then become a little bit Games Workshop-y and you're, bringing out different rule sets every 3 years to keep up with the meta, and so it's a strength and a weakness. So what I've done here, I think, is quite standard within the BattleTech community, in that I have just created my own rule set. In terms of how this kind of looks as a synopsis, and I'll go through each phase of the game and talk about my changes in each section. But in terms of a synopsis, I'd say that my rule set is about 70% classic, 20% homebrew, and about 10% Alpha Strike. Maybe a bit less on Alpha Strike. So I really don't like Alpha Strike. I think it's quite boring. I've got no compunction to play a company versus a company on tabletop. I think BattleTech is served best when it's effectively a skirmish game. So you're playing lance on lance or star on lance or whatever. The second you start introducing lots and lots of units, I think it just loses all its tactical nuance. It just becomes like a shooting gallery, and I think that's really boring. How to get around that, though, if you're playing a big narrative campaign that has a big battle in there, you just play a part of the battlefield, right? So you're just this lance finds themselves in this wood, and there's the enemy over here. The war is raging around them, and you can factor some of that in terms of the play. So you might have random artillery strikes hitting your location or whatever, and you roll a d6 for quadrants or whatever, and you can come up with all manner of creative ways to simulate a proper battlefield. But in terms of the actual battle that you are playing, on tabletop, I think the smaller you can get that down to scale, the more fun you will have. especially if you can get it down to like, 10 to 12 units on the battlefield, so maybe some combined arms, like, you've got lance on lance, but there are a couple of random tanks on there that kind of got lost in the midst of the battle and now just find themselves in support of a friendly lance or something like that. So you can do all kinds of interesting things, but keeping it on a relatively small scale is just way more fun than playing on like a massive board with 30 mechs and just like, oh yeah, well, we're just going to take the first 3 turns just trying to get as many of these off the table, because I don't know, it's just not for me anyway. I know some people like that kind of thing, and great, but for me, I much prefer skirmish warfare on tabletop. So let's get into this, and I've kind of, like I said, I've split this out into each of the sections in the phases of BattleTech, but then I've left my section for vehicles, aerotech, VTOLs, and infantry last, because the changes in that are really dramatic, and the purists will hate it. But I kind of came to the conclusion that I had to do something about how combined arms operates on a BattleTech table, or I was never going to use them. And that would have been a shame, because it is fun to play with tanks and infantry. But my rules in that are so massively different from like core BattleTech rules that a lot of people will hate that. But that's fine. You don't have to play it, obviously. So we'll start with the initiative phase, and it's kind of important to say that initiative's really, really massively important in BattleTech. If you win initiative, unlike most games, you go second, because if your opponent moves first, you get a massive like tactical advantage, because they're moving mechs, and then you can respond to their movement in turn. And you only have to play BattleTech once to realise what a massive advantage that gives you. It's almost too much of an advantage. I think it probably does need an entire like rethink on how initiative works. And I know some gaming sets have done it. I've seen, for instance, that Death from Above Wargaming, who've got their own rule set, they've got like their own like initiative table that they utilise. So I just use standard. I just use the 2d6 system. But I have one major change when it comes to combined arms. Now, generally speaking, all the combined arms stuff I'm going to talk about here is going to be at the back end of this little vlog. But this one's important. And what I do, because it's obviously always beneficial to move last in BattleTech. If you can, like the model that moves last has the big advantage on the battlefield. So all tanks, infantry, and VTOLs, they actually move before the mechs. So regardless of where the mechs are, like in the initiative phase, if you've say got 2 tanks and 2 VTOLs on there, like a tank and a VTOL for each side, they would all move before the mechs even go. Now I do that for 2 reasons. One is a fluff reason, one is a mechanical reason. And when I've said this as well, I've not gone through every line of copy in Total Warfare, because that book is a bit of a nightmare. I've kind of tried to get through it as best as I can and cherry pick what I want. There may be a rule on initiative for combined arms in there that maybe mirrors what I'm saying here. I've got no idea. But I came to a conclusion very quickly that I needed to give an advantage to the mechs to stop people trying to spam vehicles, because the initiative advantage is considerable. And how I kind of justify it in the fluff is because of the Neuro helmets. The mech warriors are tied into their mechs, and their movement is a lot slicker and a lot more quicker than, say, like a tank, where you've got a gunner who's like, got a view scope, and he's got like a ratchet and turning the, his turret. Probably not that, rudimentary, but like he's got a button to press to turn his turret or whatever. And they've got to shout to each other, like 10 o'clock, whatever, like where to shoot. Or something on radar, whereas a mech warrior is just like completely acting like symbiotically with the mech, like the scanning system or sensors, and it's there in the mech warrior's head. And obviously they've got the they've got like the control panels and things like that, but ultimately they're tied directly into the mech's movement pattern, and I think that should give them like an initiative advantage. In terms of infantry, you could say, well, why would the infantry not move with them? Because they're all individual human beings. Well, they still act in squads, and they still kind of, they're reliant on like a commanding officer to kind of either radio in or shout at them, look over there, enemy, shoot. And that then acts on that like delayed time frame. Because keep in mind that a game of BattleTech on tabletop, you might play it over a 2.5-3 hour period, but in reality, it's kind of 2 minutes of warfare on a battlefield. So those like split seconds really count, and obviously a mech operating with a Neuro helmet I think gives them an advantage. The mechanical reason why I do it within the gaming set is that I think it really stops like the meta listing of vehicles and infantry, which I really don't like in BattleTech. Like I get why people do it, and I've spoken about this recently on the video about the clans, that you can use those like meta lists to defeat the clans. I don't take any joy in that though, and I don't really think the people who do it take any joy. They're just like crunchy tabletop players who like to kind of get the W, and I'm like, okay, like this 13-year-old mentality to winning on tabletop is slightly stupid. We're there to have fun. If you're playing competitively, I want it to be competitive. I want it to be balanced. If I had to go competitively and someone rocked up with, several multiple dozens of like really annoying little vehicles, like the Savannah Master, I'd be like, I'm not going to take any joy from this. This person's kind of just told me that they're really pathetic, and I don't want to play them again. So they probably would beat me, but I'd be like, yeah, you're never going to be invited to my place, pal, because you're really boring. I much prefer it if people can bring crunchy units by all means, but be sensible. And I know a lot of tournaments will impose things like that. Like they'll say you can only have a maximum of X amount of vehicles or infantry, and you've got to have at least a lance of mechs, and use this amount of battle value to, or whatever you want to do to try and stop that, which is always beneficial because people can be really pathetic on tabletop. It's quite sad. Like I always think, like, have a think about it, come up with a force that's going to be fun to play, but a little bit crunchy. I mean, there's nothing wrong with bringing, like a Battle Cobra to the tabletop, which are very crunchy mechs. But you really can't, like, expect everyone to act on an adult level. Some people are just like, oh, I've got to win at all costs, and that can be really, like, problematic. That's my own opinion anyway. You may disagree with that, as is your right, but I'm not particularly keen on playing people who kind of get into that mindset. So that's a way that I kind of trump it, really, and allow the mechs to be the centrifugal force in BattleTech, which it should be on tabletop, because they're the really, like, fun things to play with. But again, I'm going to talk about vehicles and VTOLs and infantry further down the line, because there are some significant changes there. So next up, we've got movement. My movement is pretty much identical, apart from I play on 3D terrain. So what that means is that I just equate one hex to one movement point. I tend to play on slightly bigger maps than you'd get on, if you had like, I think maybe if you put like the surface area of 3 of the regular like paper map sheets together, that would probably be the surface area that I usually play on, just on like a rectangle. So I don't necessarily feel the need, like in Alpha Strike, where you've got this like massive bump in movement, so that basically the units get into each other quicker and the game's quicker. I don't feel like I have to do that. That kind of ties in with a bit of a change I make later on in the weapons section. But that's like a movement. Fine. Movement for me as well, it's exactly the same. So if you're going up one level, so like on a little hill, it costs you 2 movement points. Jumping's the same, running's the same, can't run backwards, things like that. All the regular rules I kind of have as is. Just checking my notes here, making sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, okay. So on 3D terrain though, it becomes, with movement, there's a lot more going on. Like, I'll say that there's a lot more going on, but there's also less in some respect, because I don't use the wood system. So, like if you're in like heavy cover woods, you get like a +2 to hit. I never do that. And I'll go on to talk about like line of sight and terrain and things like that in the next section. But it's just more fun on 3D terrain, because you really can like use that terrain to your advantage, as opposed to like a regular 2-dimensional map where it never does it for me, does that? I always find it really quite boring, and it kind of upsets me, because you spend so much time like collecting these wonderful models and painting them. I want it to be immersive. I want to be able to see my force in an urban environment with buildings around them, and not just like a flat map. So that's a personal choice. Weapons I change quite a bit. And the main change that I deal with is actually in the ranges. And this kind of ties into the fact that I keep movement the same for mechs. So, like if you're going on a classic BattleTech sheet, if the movement of a mech is 4-6-4, so walking 4, running 6, jumping 4, that's just equates to inches. But what I do instead is and this is to speed the game up a little bit as well, I actually change the modifiers on the ranges. So it's short is 0 modifier, medium is +2, and a long range is +4. Obviously, when you're talking about pluses in BattleTech, it's negative, and minus modifiers are good for you. So it's just a bit of an oddity. I actually do short range 0, medium range +1, long range +3, and I do that to kind of for the two reasons I've said. One, to mitigate the fact that I just move at the same amount of rate, and I usually play on bigger boards. But secondly, it does speed the game up, and it really kind of gives a more tactical game because people aren't so desperate just to get into short range, which is kind of usual in BattleTech, and I think I personally don't like that. Physical attacks are great in BattleTech, and it's a really fun, part of the gaming system because it's so extreme and it can be really, dangerous. Physical attacks are really, powerful in BattleTech. But if you've kind of got a mech that does, really good medium range, damage, and you've got a decent mech warrior in there, and it knows it's going to be shooting at, rather than it being +8, +9, it's, +7. And that +7 just means that mech is able to skirmish correctly on the medium. Same for long range mechs. If you've got a mech that's just wanting to do LRM spam from behind, I think giving it a +3 is slightly more, gives it a little bit of an advantage, but not too much. These aren't massive deviations that I've got here in the rule set. One of the massive changes that I use, this obviously ties into movement as well, is line of sight. But more obviously orientated towards weapons when you're talking about line of sight. Now, for me, when I kind of got back into tabletop gaming a few years ago, I came in again playing a lot of Kill Team, which I really, really like. Version 1 of Kill Team, I think it's a really good game. It can be quite complex, it takes a while to learn, but generally speaking, I really enjoy that mechanic. And there's a mechanic in Kill Team that simplifies so much of the nonsense with line of sight, and it basically just says that if even a toe of your unit is behind a fence, they get the modifier bonus, to hit. And I do the same for this. So, cause sometimes, and it's the worst thing I think you can do to tabletop gaming is when you say, oh, if 30% of the mech is covered, then it gets a modifier. It's what are you going to do? Get a protractor out and a compass and actually measure that? Do me a favour. It's so arbitrary. I hate that rule. To me, it's a gaming rule made by people who don't play many tabletop games, because I do not want to have to spend time looking and deciding whether something is, 33% obscured. It's absolutely ridiculous. Just can't be bothered with that. So I just say if even the tip of a weapon is behind the building, then it's obscured. And I like that rule. It's a good rule. It works very well. I've done a lot of play testing with that. It's much easier. There's no drama in it, and you've got to do that on 3D terrain. You can't rely on on the paper hex map where it's very obvious because it will say level 1, level 2 on each hex. You don't get that on 3D terrain, so you've kind of got to make your own judgments about it. I also operate a pretty fair system. If there is any dispute, let's say it was that tip of a weapon and someone was well, I think you can see it, well, I think I can't, then you just roll a d6. 1, 2, 3, it's a no. 4, 5, or a 6, it's a yes, and that mitigates all arguments, and you talk about that beforehand and you're ready to go. Another thing that I do is, and this kind of comes from Kill Team, but it's in a lot of gaming systems as well. I don't think it exists in BattleTech. At least I've never read it when I was going through all the rule sets. But I like to give what I call a cover bonus. So what I mean by that is if you've got a mech that's directly in base contact with a building, but it can see over or to the side, then it takes the defensive +1 bonus, but it doesn't have to take the the negative to hit its opponent, because the way I look at it is the mech's kind of really well positioned, and it can just bob out and shoot its weaponry and then kind of maybe just tuck back into cover. That I really like because it really makes people think tactically about it. It also mitigates a rule that I don't use in BattleTech. I don't think this is used in Alpha Strike either. And it's a rule I really hate because people either forget about it, or it's one of those things where you just constantly have to think about it. And that's that if any part of a mech is obscured and the opponent hits that target when they're rolling on the hit location table, then it's whatever it is, the ballistic, the missile, the laser, whatever it is, hits the terrain as opposed to the mech. And I really don't like that rule because although it's tactically good, because it means like if you had damage to your right hand side of your mech, you could position yourself so your right hand side is completely obscured. So it's good in that respect, but it's a real like pain in the backside to manage when you're doing what is quite a long game anyway. So I don't do that. And the way I kind of justify it is a mech is continuously in motion. So a mech that's trying to get to cover will have to kind of, it's such a big, clunky object. It's going to have to kind of move around quite a bit. And it might at one time show that right thigh that is then kind of able to get struck by the enemy. Because although we're playing in turn-based, as a simulation it's meant to be in real time. And the turn-based element is just to kind of put a system on it where we can actually play a game with dice. Because if you did it in real time, it'd obviously be complete chaos. So, I kind of factor it in is that having that system in is very much, again, people that designing games without really thinking about the fact that it's a simulation and the turn-based thing is there to supplement and support that as opposed to dictate what's going on in reality. That's my justification for it anyway. I mean, I'd love to be honest, I wouldn't mind playing that rule if it wasn't so laborious and annoying. It is tactically quite an astute rule to put in, but again, for the reasons cited, not for me. The next up, I've got some changes on weapons. So that's kind of that's kind of core how things shoot. Everything else I do the same. So whether it's like cluster tables, ranges for weapons, things like that, I'm all the same. But there are two things in BattleTech that I think are really broken in Classic, and this is absolutely no surprise to anyone, and that's AC weaponry and machine guns. Now, I've spoken a little bit about AC weaponry on the channel before, and I think from a fluff perspective, it makes sense for UAC weaponry to be slightly obsolete because, it's ammo-based, it's kind of the cheap option, whereas having things like PPCs and lasers are really kind of like, even in the Succession Wars, it's very much like advanced sci-fi tech. So I kind of get it that they wanted to put some like negatives in there for AC weaponry. But I think they went too far, and I think there are two ways to do this, and I've thought many ways about trying to fix AC weaponry. And the first is quite easy, and that's just to kind of, do you want to increase the damage of the weapon? So, let's say you could have like an AC 5, which does 5 points of damage. You could up that to 7. I don't particularly like that. I wouldn't mind doing it, and I've toyed with it, and I've done. I think I've spoken about it on the channel before as well. That is something that I've done in the past. But I came across a rule set in one of the tactical operations books, I can't remember which one it was, that basically talks about the double tap. And I think that's a superb rule. Now, a double tap is what traditionally a UAC, so an ultra auto cannon, does. But it basically says you can also do that with a regular AC, but it does have penalties. So on a UAC, which is the more superior version, if you roll snake eyes when trying to hit, the weapon jams and you can't use the weapon again for the remainder of the battle. Okay, so there's a risk to double tapping, but if you do double tap, because you then have to roll on the cluster table to see if both shells hit, if you do, you can do pretty devastating damage to an opponent, especially if you hit them with a UAC 20. They are pretty terrifying. For an AC though, it gets a little bit more spicy. So on a 3 or a 4, on 2d6, on a 3 or a 4, it's judged that the weapon is jammed, so exactly the same consequence. But on Snake Eyes, the shell in the auto cannon actually explodes, and it does that amount of damage to your internals. Now, with an AC2, that's like, okay, 2 points of damage to internals. So it will be problematic, obviously, if you roll an 8+ and have to do crits to yourself. But generally speaking, you're like, okay, it can be worth the risk, Probably not with an AC20. Double tapping with an AC20, unless it's like you are in desperate, your mech's wrecked and you're on your last turn and you're going to get explode pretty soon. Then obviously you might as well double tap at that point. But generally speaking, you've got to be careful with it. But if you get the hit with it, it's just so beautiful. I've done that a few times where you, especially like with an AC-10 or an AC-20, it can really kind of game change for you. And it allows autocannons, I think, to be, there's a bit of risk with it, but the payoff if you roll well is really, really worth it. Now that's an official rule. The rule that I said there, all that's official. The one thing I didn't talk about there was heat. So the only consequence is if you do double tap, this is with UAC weaponry as well, it's double heat. So I think just going off memory here, I think an AC-20 does 7 heat. So if you double tapped, you'd have 14 heat created on your mech. The one that I really wanted to change though, because ACs they're not bad, but they're like a bit meh in like classic BattleTech, and you like, why would you take them when you've got like the ammo consequences and nobody has case and things can blow up very easily in classic BattleTech. But the second thing that I really wanted to fix was machine guns. Again, no surprise to anyone because machine guns in BattleTech are awful, and I actually homebrew my own rule for this. So I'll just talk through what I do with that. Now, let's say you've got, like before the game, you have to decide what all your mechs or vehicles or infantry and everything else, what kind of machine guns they have. And I've got 3 criteria. I've got controlled bursts, rapid bursts, and uncontrolled bursts. Now, from the point of view, I'll deal with each one separately. So control bursts expand 10 points of ammo. That's important to note because machine gun ammo, like you could shoot all day with a machine gun with how ammo is in BattleTech and you'd never run out. I don't like that. It's very dangerous. In fact, it's good if you run out of machine gun ammo because then it can't explode and take a crit. So it's having 10 points on a control burst. That means that effectively you get, 20 shots of it. But a control burst, which if you think of it, the terminology, it's like daka daka, daka daka. So, you just kind of pinpoint shooting. And how I operate this is the range goes up to 3, 6, 9. So 3 for short, 6 for medium, 9 for long. It only does 1 point of damage, so it basically becomes like another crit seeker for your mech, and it generates no heat. So great. So it's like damage isn't very good, but range is okay. And you can do 20 of them. So it's very much like it just becomes a bit of a medium range crit seeker with total, the total range it can shoot at is 9 inches at long. The second one, which is rapid base, this consumes 20 ammo. So you basically, if you've got rapid ammo and you've got, if you're doing rapid bursts and you've got that 1 ton of ammo, which is 200, you basically get 10 shots of this. The range for this goes to 246. It does 1 D3 damage and it does 1 D3, the same D3 for damage it does for heat. So if you roll a 4, you do 2 damage and make 2 heat. Nice and simple. The last one, which is kind of the infantry killer, this is uncontrolled burst. So that's just like, daka, 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 daka. So you just kind of, the range is, it's not the range that's terrible, it's just the accuracy is terrible. That's kind of how I equate machine guns in BattleTech. So the range for this is the kind of vanilla version. It's 1, 2, 3, so very, very short range. But it's 1d6 of damage, and that equates to 1d6 of heat. So you've got to be quite careful with that, because if you had 2 machine guns and rolled like 2 6s with it, you're generating 12 heat. Yes, you're doing 12 damage, but 12 heat as well. And if you fire your other weapons, it really adds like an extra variable to BattleTech, so you can really heat up your mechs accidentally just by rolling good numbers with that level of machine guns, if you're doing the uncontrolled burst anyway. And one thing I forgot to mention there, ammo expenditure for an uncontrolled burst is 25, so you only get 8 shots of it on 1 ton of ammo. And again, I like that because it just means that there is less, you can shoot those just like get in close proximity and go mad with it. But then that, after like 4 turns, there's only like 100 rounds left in there. So, and obviously, even if that exploded, you'd cause major drama to yourself. But, it's a heightened chance that you'll get rid of all that ammo by the time you're taking crits. That's kind of how I look at it. Otherwise, if you play classic BattleTech machine guns, which are absolutely terrible, people just get rid of the ammo. Like in the end phase, which is one of the rules as written, if you kind of go into the total warfare, but you basically dump it all out of the rear of the mech. And people do that. People just like, I don't need that because it's just a liability, so get rid of it. And that just kills like an entire weapon, which is quite a fun weapon as well. It's, especially if you like how I've kind of got it there, where you know that if you're playing with uncontrolled bursts and you really want to close down with a mech and just go absolutely mad, and you risk overheating your mech and just chewing another mech up, it's quite a fun thing to do. So that's the weapons phase. Physical phase, I've got nothing to talk about because I do exactly the same physical as rules written, and I really like the physical rules in BattleTech. It's very fun. It's very like overpowered in a lot of ways, but it's really great. Like, you know, when you can punch with both arms and you get to hit on the punch location table, where it means you've got a 1 in 6 chance of hitting the head. So it speeds the game up quite a bit. Does physical combat. It's also really good tactic against the clans because they don't like it. You know, as Corporal Jones says in Dad's Army, they don't like it up 'em. Only the British people will probably get that reference. But that's kind of how I feel about the clans. They are like moral cowards. So just run in there and start beating them with fists and feet, and they'll soon be put to the sword when you bring your far superior numbers to the battlefield as an Inner Sphere player. Next up, we got the end turn, and I do make some considerable changes in this. So one thing that I do, and this really, really helps speed the game up, is you use the cripple system for mechs. Now, all the damage that I record, I use on the Flex app, and I absolutely love the Flex app. It's such a great tool. There are other ones as well, you know, where you can just do it's basically like an app to record damage. But one thing that I love with the Flex app is that it will tell you when a mech is crippled. And I'm sure other apps do this as well, but it's very, it just comes up like a big red flag, like crippled. And your mech is crippled under several different situations. So, for instance, if you lose one torso or side torso, your mech's judged crippled. I can't remember the rule for the internal damage. I think if it's that more than 3 locations get more than 1 point of internal damage, then you're crippled as well. I think it's that. I don't really even know because I just use the Flex app so often. It just tells me on there, you are crippled, and I'm like, oh dear. Now, if you play this rule as written, it really helps speeds the game up in terms of the morale. The rules as written as morale in the game, but I change it up a little bit and homebrew it a little bit. But what it means is that a crippled mech has to basically take a morale check in the end phase, and if they fail it, it's like a forced withdrawal. Now, I kind of take it to an extremity because I kind of look at it like if your mech force withdrawals, so several things happen. So the mech, and I kind of look at it like all the mech warriors are going to be well trained, right? Generally speaking. So they don't just fly off the tabletop and run away. They steadily retreat backwards and they're still able to use their weapons. But they've got to go to their side of the table by the fastest route possible via walking. If they if there's anything stopping, if there are things in the way of it, they can potentially jump. I mean, I kind of leave that to the discretion of the player, but basically they've got to end up closer to their line at the end of the turn as far as they can go. Some mechs can actually have a bit of an advantage. Like if they have, say, a leg blown off, they'll only be able to walk very slowly back, and that will give them the opportunity to then keep firing. But how I kind of look at it in terms of the rules, I have a mech that's on force withdrawal is actually seen in the kind of wider context of the game as a destroyed or an immobile mech, which means that if you had, say, 2 mechs that had force withdrawn and the other 2 mechs in a lance have been destroyed, your game is over. And that really, really speeds the game up. I mean, it literally might take 45 minutes out of a game sometimes because you can get that final critical, position on a mech. They roll for morale in the end phase, they fail it, and then that's it, the game's over. So it's like a morale check failure. And that, I think, because a lot of my inspiration from playing modern tabletop games comes from things like Kill Team, which I do think has a good rule set. They have kind of a similar thing with morale as well. Like once you've broken a unit, that's it, really, like the game's done. So you stand up, you shake hands, and you're like, well, you've got 2 viable mechs left on the table, and I've got 2 crippled and 2 withdrawn. So at that point, everyone's going home basically on your side, so you've lost. I do have my own rules for morale, very easy. And I like this because I like to play narrative games, or like continuation on narrative games. And how I do it is every mech warrior is assigned like a morale number. Now, I usually do it as like the general number is 6, so like a regular inner sphere mech warrior. People say 4-5, right? So 4 for gunnery, 5 for piloting. I say 4-5-6. So 4 for gunnery, 5 for piloting, 6 for morale. And you've just got to beat that score. So you get crippled, you roll a 5, you're in force withdrawal. You get crippled, you roll an 8, your mech warrior's fine. But on the next turn, in the next end phase, you've got to do the same again. So you've got to continually roll in every end phase once you are crippled, or once you kind of fit one of the criteria that means you have to take a morale test. You're on borrowed time, really, because eventually you're going to roll a 4 and then the mech has to withdraw. But it just gives you that little bit of a leeway to continue. Potential, and if you're a 6 on morale, you've got a higher chance of hitting that than not hitting it, because the most common number to hit on 2d6 is a 7, so you've got a decent chance of making it. That's it. That's pretty much my rules changes within Tabletop BattleTech. But the next section, which I'm going to talk about, which is vehicles and I'll say combined arms, and I've just got, you can't see this, but I've got the kind of the rules that I've written down for this here just so I can reference it. Now, this is controversial, and I wouldn't expect, this isn't me saying, oh, this is a really good idea and something you can do. A lot of people will hate this. I completely understand why. But I've got a theory with combined arms that nobody wants to keep record sheets for infantry, elementals, tanks, VTOLs, anything else. The only thing you want to keep record sheets for is mechs, because in a way we anthropomorphise the mechs. They're even human shaped. I don't want to have to do the same for vehicles. It's very boring. So what I do instead is I created a system where I went to see the total armour value of, let's say it's a tank. Let's say it's a pretty well-armoured tank as well, like a Rommel, something like that. And what I do is I will give that tank... I'm not going to go through the math on how I did this. It's all quite simple, though, but I will kind of give it a number. So it's got... I think with a Rommel, for me, for instance, it's got 10 hit points. And what I do is I'll then keep a track by dice next to the Rommel. And I always use yellow dice, because you use red, black and white for movement of vehicles and mechs and everything else. So I'd use yellow dice, and if it takes damage, so it's got 10 hit points, so if it takes 3 points of damage, it's got a 3 next to it. Once it gets to 10, the vehicle explodes. Now, why it's heresy is because obviously that's just very cut and dry, because usually with vehicles you've got things like you've got engine hits, you've got hits on the turret, or the vehicle might be waylaid, but it can still use its turret to shoot, things like that. I can't be bothered managing any of that in BattleTech, and I know that if I had to do that, I just wouldn't bother. I'd just be I'm just playing mechs, I'm not playing with combined arms. I want it to be quite quick with vehicles. I want them, with infantry as well, I want them to be more of a hindrance and a nuisance on the battlefield, and giving you an extra little buff to initiative or whatever you want, as opposed to them being the centre of the drama that's going on. I know that's quite heretical, but in every game that I've played with rules as written for vehicles and infantry, they end up taking over. It's really difficult to destroy a vehicle. It's not, they've got kind of the same damage mechanics as mech. So yes, it's not too difficult to stop them from moving, but then trying to they might be just stuck still, but they can use their turret. Yes, that adds a lot of interest to the game, but it's micromanage it, and I don't like it. So I use my damage system, and thus far in all the playtesting, it's actually worked really well. And all I do then is I've got a list here in front of me that you can't see, which is a list of every weapon in BattleTech and how many weapon damage they do. So for instance, an L laser does 2 points of damage. So you've got 10 points. So an L laser shaves off 2 points of damage if it hits. An LRM5 does 1, regardless of how many clusters hit. LRM10 does 1, regardless of how many clusters hit. LRM15 does 2. LRM20 does 2. Again, regardless of how many clusters hit. Now, I do that because, although you look at that and you think, well, it should be more than 2 for an LRM20. Well, no, because you're going to roll a 7 on 2d6. So you're not necessarily going to get all the 20 points of damage. As well, missiles hitting vehicles isn't the worst thing in the world, right? they can take that because the missiles in BattleTech don't do much damage. Getting hit by an AC-20 shell, however, is going to cause a lot of damage. So, will do, more than like a missile will or a machine gun or whatever else. So I really kind of, I like that system within, actually I might have been looking at the wrong table. That might be in the infantry table. Oh, it's still the same anyway, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, it's fine. I just noticed that because the AC-20 was listed at quite low level of damage. That's for infantry, and that makes sense for infantry because they're spread out. So an AC-20 shell hitting a squad, for me, it kind of evaporates two of the guys, whereas the other guys are probably 10 metres away and just look around and see Paul, Bob and John, no longer there. Whereas for a vehicle, they do an AC-20 does 3 points of damage because it's just one single 20 bang, 20 points of damage on as rules as written BattleTech, so it can be quite devastating. So that's an important thing. The damage tables are different for each different unit. So infantry, vehicles, VTOLs all take different kinds of damage. Infantry as well, I've kind of separated it out into actual infantry and battle armor as well, because obviously battle armor is going to have higher levels of armor as you would expect. So that's how I do the system. Again, I've playtested it quite a lot now, and it's so fun because you just run in with your tanks, and given that that you've got this damage level that you can do there, rather than micromanaging, it becomes a bit of a resource game because you've got to decide, your opponent's got to say, am I going to expend this LRM-20, which I could shoot at the mech, on just trying to kind of hit this tank and just take it out? So then it's all the same rules. So it's same rules to hit, same rules for range, everything else. It's just that the damage system is managed by dice next to the vehicle or the infantry unit or whatever else. I probably will change this as I go on. I'll probably play test it more and be actually that doesn't work, or that needs more damage, or that needs less damage, or whatever. But thus far, I think I've really kind of hit a chord. And I actually really love taking combined arms now, whereas before I'd be oh my god, how many sheets am I managing here? Now it's just I've got my lance of 4 that I'd can manage those mechs, and then there are 5 tanks and several infantry and a VTOL carrier with some infantry in there who are going to drop somewhere. It just seems to work, so I'm happy with it anyway, and that's how I'm going to teach people and continue playing. Obviously, I will tell them very early on. I'll be look, this is my homebrew for it. So if you ever go to a tournament, make sure you get Total Warfare and read it. It's very, very different from my rule set. But thus far, having a lot of fun with that. There are obviously I'm only touching on the kind of core elements here. When I've been playtesting, there are certain things that I've kind of had to stop in the game or change completely because it doesn't fit to that damage system. But I'm not going to go into them now because that's a little bit superfluous for this. Just suffice to say that my combined arms section is wholly different. The last point, and this is something that you're probably thinking, he's omitted this. Well, no, I'm going to talk about it now. Is actually air support and artillery. I actually don't use any models for air support. I think having a game that's set on whether it's 6mm or whether it's at bigger scale or whatever, having air units on there that are proper air units, aeroplanes, that don't have a VTOL's hover, they just go whoosh across the battlefield, is the worst. It's so. And you see this in I've seen this on Warhammer where they've got flying units that just kind of fly off the battle table and then back onto it. It's just awful. I hate it. BattleTech does something similar. I just think it's really terrible. So luckily, and I think people at Catalyst must agree with me on this because they created a system recently where there's a card system for artillery and air support where you have a plane can do a bombing run or a strafing run, or that you can incorporate minefields, artillery strikes. Artillery I wouldn't mind actually having on tabletop, but it's just far easier to kind of assume that the artillery is way back on the line and firing back. That obviously makes sense. The only exception to that is if you had a mission where you were defending an artillery post, then probably need some artillery on tabletop. But then, are they too close to even fire at the opposition coming to them? Possibly, because artillery is usually long ranged. So that's it. They're kind of my weird homebrew rules, and I really did want to do that video because I reference my homebrews quite a bit. So it's quite nice that I've been able to kind of put it all into one video. And if anyone ever asks me a question, I can be like, haha, well, there's a video on this that you can watch if you're interested, and you can know the reference that I'm talking about now. So what I'd probably say is, to sum it all up, I'd say I don't really change that much on tabletop, and I still utilise a lot of classic. But the combined arms thing, wholly different. I've also come up with a lot of little techniques to speed the game up. I'm not going to go into those now. I may do a video at one time on like things to just make BattleTech run a lot more smoothly. The one that I think is massively helpful is Flex. I'll talk about that for a second, then I'll finish the video. I won't go into any of the others. I might save that for another day. But Flex is so good, and it's just that real-time damage system as an app. This is how I do it. I've got a music stand, so something you put music paper on. I've got one of those, and I put like a pretty big laptop on there, with a big screen. It's got like it's here in front of me. It's maybe like a 17, 18-inch screen. So I put it on the music stand and kind of flip it upright so that both opponents then can see the damage sheets. They're really clear as well, next to the table. And usually then, because I'm so familiar with Flex, I'll just manage it in real time. So I'm quite a dab hand at multitasking, so I can roll dice and then do damage, and my opponent can see all that. So it's not like it's right in front of me and I'm like, oh wait, he said left torso, I'm going to put it on the right, because some people do that, some people cheat. He can see it, or she can see it right there on the app where I'm assigning the damage, what's happening, and they can call you out on it in real time and say, I think you put that on the head and not the left leg, or whatever. Not that I'd ever do such a thing, obviously, but just Flex as a system is just amazing. I know that you can get more intricate with Flex, and you can actually run it as a real-time gaming simulator. I don't actually do that. I tried it once and I found it a little bit too much. It's good what they've done, but I think I prefer to kind of keep things in my head, which I can usually do, rather than letting that micromanage everything. But it will do wonderful little things in there. You can actually do this really fun thing in there where you can make the mech go prone, and everything gets slanted, which I love. So it's just, when your mech is down on the floor and it's prone, that reflects then in the app sheet. It will tell you when to do PSR checks. It will tell you, if you get a leg actuator damaged or a foot actuator, it will tell you what the impacts are on your movement. It will change that in real time, as opposed to you forgetting to write that in, and then you're moving for 3 turns at full speed with your mech, even though the leg actuator and the foot actuator have been busted up. Or worse, your hip actuator's broken and you're still doing kicks and causing damage to people. It's really easy to see in Flex what you can and can't do, because it will just cross out. When your hip actuator gets damaged, it just tells you no more attacking with this leg. Wonderful. And that to me is a massive time saver. Anyway, I'm going to finish that here. So hopefully that gave you all some food for thought in regards to your tabletop experience. And there's so much in BattleTech. There are so many books, there's so many different reference points, so many opinions on it, and you can cherry pick what you want. And if you're really kind of going down that rabbit hole of BattleTech rules, it's actually, I think the original classic game, there is so much wrong with it. It's actually fun to change, and it's fun to know that you're creating a way better gaming system than they originally did. And you might, like me with the vehicle thing, I'm sure other people do stuff like that, but for me, that's quite unique to how I'm playing, and I know that it's way better than the record keeping. I just know from playtesting it for what is now upwards of dozens and dozens of hours, and I'm I'd never go back now. I never ever want to keep a record sheet for anything that's not a mech. Anyway, I'll leave it there, so I'll thank you very much for watching, and I'll hopefully catch you again next time.